A rather uneventful beta cycle is over, and with Kirara being announced today, it's time for me to address her Quicken potential in detail. When I say uneventful beta cycle, I'm talking about the fact Kirara received no particular changes during the past few weeks, so what I said previously in the videos I made about her has mostly stayed true. Following the roadmap Dendro defensive characters like Yaya and Baizhu have traced, Kirara is also a defensive unit. The difference is that unlike those two characters, who focus on healing, Kirara focuses on shielding. This, however, doesn't necessarily define her potential team synergies, as that's entirely dependent on what she's able to offer offensively, but we'll get to that later. Kirara is a pretty great shielder. This mechanic of her is tied to her elemental skill, which has two versions, a tap and a hold one. The tap skill can produce a shield that's around 10,000 HP with an 8 seconds cooldown. This is pretty great durability for a shield that can technically be recasted multiple times throughout a rotation, which will definitely be viable on quickswap teams like Genshin Quicken and Nilou, so teams where she's allowed to take the field multiple times a rotation. Moreover, she can make her own shield stronger by using the hold version of her elemental skill, which transforms her into a sort of a cat box, a state in which she can perpetually attack opponents with Dendro attacks that have a cooldown of 0.5 seconds based on each opponent. Each of these attacks will trigger her Ascension 1 passive, which basically reinforces her shield by 20%, up to 3 times, allowing the shield to reach 15,000 effective health, assuming Kirara is using an HP build. This version of the skill has a longer cooldown, so it's definitely a better option for teams where Kirara isn't allowed to take the field much, for example Sino teams. Offensively, at Constellation 0, Kirara's output is mostly generated by her elemental burst, which kind of works like Klee's elemental skill, as it has an initial cast that damages opponents on a wide AoE range and then scatters 6 bombs in a circular range around Kirara. These bombs will either explode after a set period of time or when an enemy goes in contact with them. Application-wise, this burst is able of generating a lot of instantaneous Dendro gauge AoE, which is the type of front load teams like Nilou benefit from in particular. Sadly, her sustained application is not quite on the same level, as she has no source of off-field Dendro damage at Constellation 0, which means she's not a good off-field Hyperbloom or Burgeon unit at this stage. Her on-field application has more upside, since the hold version of her elemental skill, which has standard internal cooldown, will be able of generating a lot of Dendro hits throughout its duration. The issue, however, is that these hits don't count as normal attacks, meaning she can't drive units like Shincho or Yelan, effectively putting an end to his Hyperbloom and Burgeon dreams. Constellations make things better for her. Specifically, her Constellation 1 and Constellation 4 have application-related perks. The Constellation 1 simply increases the amount of bombs she creates with her burst to 10. Since her bomb's application is based on standard internal cooldown, that technically increases the amount of times Dendro can be applied to a single unit through them by 2. But since the bombs are scattered in such a wide AoE range, it's fair to expect that each opponent will only be hit by 2 or 3 bombs in a certain moment. This means that guessing how much the Constellation will actually impact Kirara as a Dendro player is a tall task at the moment. The Constellation 4 is much clearer, as it allows Kirara to throw a Dendro attack every 3.8 seconds as long as one of her shields is protecting the team. This can assumedly work while she's off-field as well, which is huge as it essentially gives her kit an entirely different dimension, while allowing her to generate Dendro aura 4 or 5 times per rotation. The Constellation 6 is also quite relevant for Quicken teams specifically, as it buffs the elemental damage generated by the team by 15% on practically 100% uptime. Effectively, this accounts for a 5% team-wide damage increase for all Quicken teams. On the other hand, this Constellation is not that important if you plan to get her for Bloom-oriented teams. Builds-wise, she fundamentally has 2 options in terms of artifacts. The first one should generally be the Instructor set, a set that provides elemental mastery for the whole team if the holder generates an elemental reaction, with a 8 seconds duration. This aligns perfectly with Kirara's elemental skill cooldown, meaning she can maintain full uptime of it on all teams where she's allowed to take the field regularly. Alternatively, on teams where that's not possible, like Sino teams, then Deepwood or Gilded to increase her own damage becomes a possibility. In fact, especially at high Constellation levels, Kirara's damage is worth investing in if you have a 5-star weapons like Jade Cutter, as her ceiling can reach around 250,000 damage per rotation in those scenarios. In general, unless you have access to that level of hyper investment, then Instructor will be your best bet even on Sino teams. On a side note, she can work as a Deepwood holder for the purpose of reducing Dendro resistance to enable damage dealers like Alhaitham. Stats wise, unless you take that hyper investment approach I talked about before, it's better for you to just build her with HP artifacts to maximize her shield potential. The reason is that if she's holding something like Instructor, then swapping from full damage stats to full HP stats will only cause a 50,000 damage per rotation loss, which is hardly noticeable. On the other hand, offensive builds will almost halve her shield durability compared to HP builds, which should be more noticeable. Also, she'll have no particular energy requirements on any team, since her burst energy cost is 60, and she should be able to generate 7 or 8 particles per rotation through his skills. Besides, most of the teams she'll be used on function in a 25 seconds rotation, which gives her plenty of additional time to recover the little energy she needs. Weapons-wise, excluding the hyper-invested thing I talked about before, you'll mostly want utility options, so Favonius or Sacrificial Sword for the 4 stars, and Freedom Sword or Key of Kajnishet for the 5 stars. Specifically, regarding Key, she should be able to activate its passive effects fully, since they require the holder to attack opponents with an elemental skill 3 times to provide elemental mastery related benefits for the whole team, and she can do exactly that through the old version of her elemental skill. Teams-wise, Kirara will be perfect for Quicken teams at Constellation 0. In fact, her being a defensive option that can maintain perfect Instructor uptime is enough to put her in range with the likes of Baizhu in the same role. As a reminder, using a Dendro defensive option allows you to slot in 3 offensive units in the other slots on Quicken teams, meaning you can do something like replacing Zhongli with Kazuha and increase your offensive output as a whole. Also, Kirara works better than Baizhu on triple Dendro Alhaitham teams, since her damage potential is quite a bit higher, meaning she benefits more from the advantages the composition provides for Dendro damage as a whole. At Constellation 6, she pulls ahead compared to Baizhu on basically all Quicken teams. A disclaimer is needed for Sino teams. Since Kirara has no source of off-field Dendro application below Constellation 4, unless you obtain her at that Constellation level, she practically won't be able to enable Quicken for about half of Sino's damage window, so she's essentially unusable for him outside of that scenario. She should also fit quite well on Nilou teams, since as I said before, her elemental burst is a great source of front-loaded application, so she can cover a role similar to Collei for the team. Collei is especially appreciated in speedrun scenarios, as all the applications she can generate almost instantaneously makes the team generate a lot of blooms in quick spurts, and maximizes the damage of Nilou compositions in single specific instances. Kirara works kind of the same, as her application and cooldowns are in range with Collei's, and she's also a defensive option on top of that, meaning she allows for extra team flexibility. The only issue is that her total lack of off-field Dendro application at Constellation 0 might make the composition a bit clunky unless you plan to use a Dendro as the on-field applier, since for one, Nahida's elemental skill needs continuous Dendro application from other sources to generate reactions and trigger it every couple seconds as a result. At Constellation 4, Kirara will probably be a contender for the best in slot spot on the team, and at Constellation 0 she will still be a pretty great option. All in all, Kirara is a pretty solid character, just one you might not necessarily need if you already have Baizhu or a well-built Yao Yao, since what she brings to the table in terms of themes she can help is not that different from what they can already do. I'm done for today. As always, if you enjoyed the video, make sure to leave a thumbs up and subscribe. See you next time!